but Marion Buckwalter is actually most famous for being Elizabeth Maine's mentor of the CNCDPK-12, but that's not really true. She's famous in her own right, not just because she's Elizabeth's mentor, but she'll introduce herself. But I picked her because when I had my lab down the hall from her, I was very impressed with her managerial skills. And then John has more clinical trials experience and he is a division chief. So I thought this would be a good combo to talk about budgets. So thank you both for participating, and then I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Sure, it's great to see everybody. Some of you I've met, and it's great to see your names and some of your faces. So I'm a professor at Stanford, and I study how neuroinflammation affects early and late stroke consequences, and with a particular interest in post-stroke dementia. Clinically, I'm a neurointensivist. I do 6 weeks a year, which I think is critical to my success to have a limited clinical footprint. I run a basic science lab. It's about 10 people. And then I also actually have a clinical research prospective cohort going on right now. So I have a separate clinical research group. The things that I really like about my job are mentoring. I've had a number of grad students and postdocs who are now faculty, and that's like the very best thing about being in academia. I do a lot of service, including WIN is a Women in Neurology group for American Society for Neurochemistry. I'm also deputy director of the Wusai Neurosciences Institute here, which is a trans-campus neurosciences research institute that provides funding basically for neuroscience across campus through philanthropy mostly. And then I've spent many years on study section, especially the K99 study section at NINDS. And then I'm pretty involved with the graduate program and ran graduate admissions until last year for 5 years. I'm also pretty active. So one of the things I like about academia is that I get to be an activist about diversity. So I'm head of a new diversity committee coming out of Wusai and starting a number of new initiatives and mentoring programs that we're starting up at Stanford. Personally, I'm a breast cancer survivor, and I always make sure to say this because I think at the time it felt kind of catastrophic, like it's so hard to maintain a research career, what will happen? And you're more resilient than you think, I think is the lesson. And then, personal relationships are really important to me. I like running, hiking, backpacking, travel, gardening. I like to have a life outside of work. I don't work all the time. So I'll stop there and let John introduce himself. I can figure out how to advance it. John, you're muted.
Yeah, I go by John. You have to have that at least one Zoom meeting to have someone tell you you're muted. I'm a professor in neurology, neuroscience, and pediatrics at the University of Rochester, where I've been for almost 20 years now. Currently, my research focuses on human experimental therapeutics in the NCLs, particularly natural history, early phase clinical trials, a lot of gene therapy development work right now that's currently funded by a little bit of industry funding, but mostly NIH funding. Up until about 6 years ago, I was mostly a primate physiologist and studied the neurophysiology of basal ganglia circuits, but also did human neuroimaging work focused on basal ganglia and movement disorders work. That was also funded, that was my K08, and then my first R01 and an R21 in those areas. And really, as the Batten disease work has taken off, I've moved away from that. But I do have, I think my experience running a lab has really helped inform the way I approach managing budgets for this more kind of team-oriented research. Clinically, I'm on the inpatient service 4 weeks a year, and then I've got 1 to 2 weeks or clinics per week in the outpatient setting. Much of that includes working with residents and fellows. Like Marianne, I love to mentor. I've had at every level, including high school students, work with me. And some are PhD students, some are undergrads, fellows, residents. I'm a division chief. I'm the vice chair of our department. My portfolios is primarily focused on research in the department. Recently became a co-director of our IDDRC. And I've done a number of other things, much in the clinical arena, but also a former member of NIH Council. And so have gotten to see the whole spectrum of the world of the NIH, from applying to grants, from serving on study section, to finally being on council. From a personal standpoint, my kids are 24 and 26 now, but I like to think of myself as an involved father who has always had that kind of important focus on integration and balance between my work and my non-work life. Also married to a professional, to a pediatrician, which also kind of informs how one negotiates balance between work and life as well. And then, I hope, like most of you, I have other things that I do that I find quite enjoyable and engaging. I think the most important thing to say is nobody taught me how to manage a budget. My mentors gave me some advice. I'll share a little bit of that advice, but most of it was trial and error. And I learned some lessons that I hope to convey today. So what we're going to do is Marion's going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts. I'm going to talk about some variations on those themes, and we want to devote most of the session to your questions and discussion of matters you want to talk about. There is one last thing before I quit. There is a wonderful document I found that's in the public domain on the Stanford postdoc website, and I'm going to put that link in the chat right now. That there's information there that if we were to cover it would be an hour-long lecture, and nobody wants that. So why don't you go to that site if you want to find, I found that document actually quite useful. So back to Marion.
Great, thanks, John. Let's see if I can advance the slides. Yes, so I have one slide on startup funds and run on budget, because I know some of you already may have your research groups and others may be in the process of negotiating startups, which also involves significant budgeting. So my advice on negotiation for startup funds is, first, the negotiation should really feel like a partnership. It should be about, like, what do you need to succeed? And if the department wants you to succeed, they would be interested in engaging in the conversation along that line. So it shouldn't be about, I want this much money at first. It should be about, this is what I think I need to succeed. Do you agree? And then you want to ask for what you need to succeed. And I made a spreadsheet when I did this, and I think I worked off a couple of other people's spreadsheets. Some department chairs will ask you, flat out, like, what's the number you need? But what you need is going to vary a lot depending on the environment, as we'll talk about. But think about how many people you want to have in your lab that you want them to support and for how long. Know the market. So find out from other people who are recently hired by the department in question how much they got in terms of how many people they could support with having access to all of the equipment that they need to do their research. And different departments will do this differently. I think if you can get 5 years of support, it's the best. But if you can't, get at least 3. John is nodding. And then remember, your startup has both capital costs and running costs, and your running costs are going to turn into your regular lab budget as you go along. The capital costs are really like a big bolus of initial supplies that you need, and then also equipment. And so what I did is I budgeted for new equipment, and then once I got my startup, I looked around for used equipment and things I could borrow. And I highly recommend that. Like, I bought a used Vortexer that was 30 years old for $10 when I started my lab, and it's still working. Not everything needs to be new. Consider for wherever you're negotiating with, what's available to share and how collaborative are the labs around you. I think there's a huge range at different institutions between, like, the machines in my lab belong to me and the machines on the floor belong to everybody. So I'm happy to be in a situation where the machines on the floor pretty much belong to anybody. We share equipment, and it saves a lot of money on initial startups if you can use the PCR machine in the other room, for example. I think I used Brenda's PCR machine at some point. And so find out what's available and what the cost is to you. So for shared equipment for us, we all pitch in accordance to how much we use it for maintenance costs. And then we also have cores at Stanford, which of course you'll have at many schools. And so you want to know like approximately how much money do I need to set aside? How many hours am I going to use the flow cytometry core or whatever other kinds of cores you might need? And then for capital costs for your startup, don't forget furniture. So that was a surprise to me. Like when I took over the lab, there weren't enough chairs, and they won't let you buy chairs from like Amazon. You have to buy them from a university provider, and they were like astronomically expensive. So, learn about things like that. And when you put your budget together, ask a lot of questions of people that are at that institution, whether you're there already or not, about what kind of costs they're expecting. And then for running costs, I'm going to go into that in the next page, but it's basically things that are recurring expenses. So for your ongoing budget management, you really need to follow your run rate. So don't do what Brenda was just talking about, where you find out at the last minute your grant is about to run out and you have extra money to spend. And really don't do the thing where you spend all the money and then you don't have any money. And this is really, really tricky. I try to budget it out at least 1 to 3 years ahead. Usually it's about 2 on Excel. And I'll show you an example of this. But basically, salaries are a major cost. For me, there's running mouse cage costs, monthly supplies, and then I have categories for like travel money. I'll put in there big anticipated expenses, like if I want to make a new transgenic mouse line or make a new antibody, do a big RNA-seq project. No matter how much money you have, you'll have times when you might be flush and times when you are like terrified that you won't get the next grant. And always be thrifty. So in terms of this, one of the things that I do is I usually have a senior postdoc in the lab in charge of ordering. And so if someone in the lab wants to order things, this person orders, like puts together the list that the admin is going to order. And they keep track of the costs of everything on that sheet. And I give them a monthly budget. And then I also ask to be notified if there's any large expenses. Similarly with mouse cage costs, they can really explode. They're particularly expensive here, but I don't think it's unique to here. So if you're doing some kind of animal research, we have, instead of having a journal club, about once every 3 months, we have what we call mouse club, where we go over how many cages of mice everyone in the lab has and why they have them. And so that would be the time when I'm like, do you really need 100 cages? Because those will pile up. And the last thing you want to do is spend a lot of money on mice that end up getting sacrificed because they're not used for experiments. So if they are going to be used for experiments, you also want to breed enough. So you don't want to be thrifty to the point of not doing the right experiment. You want to have the animals or the reagents or whatever to do the conclusive experiment that's well powered and that's well designed. And so the more you can kind of think ahead, especially with breeding transgenic mice, which we do a lot of, the more money you'll save. Because if you breed a cohort that's not quite the right size and you can't use them, that's also a waste of money. And then as you are managing your ongoing budget, don't expect that you will be able to write an R01 right away. Usually for myself, once I kind of have a concept, it will, from having the concept to submitting it the first time to submitting it the second time or possibly even the third time, it can take 2 to 3 years. So you can't say, well, I'm going to run out of money in a year. I need to start writing my R01 now. It has to be ahead of time. And then sort of like the same strategy that I use for being thrifty, I apply widely for my ideas. I recycle them. I might, this says repatch, but I meant repitch them. But I want to do the science I want to do. I don't want to say, oh, this is trendy, so I'm going to apply to do this research. And I want to be responsive to what reviewers say. But I also never assume that a grant is going to get funded the first time or the second time. And then this is just categories on the budget spreadsheet. So what I have on there is the money going out. So for each person, their salary. Stanford divides into vacation accrual and fringe. Fringe is what you pay. This is very important to know for your institution. Fringe is what you pay for a person's health insurance, retirement package, and any other benefits they get. And so when you budget, let's say someone's making $50,000. For us, the fringe cost is about 33% over that. So I have to budget for that, otherwise I can't pay them. Similarly, for graduate students, there might be things like tuition. Some trainees with fellowships, they may not cover their health insurance, and so you have to budget to pay their health insurance out of something else. That's one of the finer points, is that you can't always pay out of every type of account. And then these are the various categories that I have currently. I just copied them from my spreadsheet, which I will show you in a minute. And then, of course, you have the money coming in. So the grants, departmental funds, any funds you're getting because you're being paid on somebody else's grant or one of your people's being paid, that kind of thing. So I was thinking I would just briefly show you my spreadsheet. So maybe if you wouldn't mind stopping the, I'll reshare the, and you can start recording again.
Thanks. So I do things in a somewhat similar way. I think one of the points that that presentation raises, that each institution's a little bit different. Particularly for fringe benefits, vacation accrual here, it's all lumped into the fringe benefits. And so make friends with your grants management office at your institution. And early communication is better than last minute communication, because they will help you project a lot of things. Some institutions have a division. There are pre-award management people and post-award management people. Other institutions, it's the same person that does both, but they're assigned to you or your division or your department. But they're different types of budgeting and different types of reporting. So again, get to know your grants management person, because they can help you, particularly with your own institutional requirements about these things. I want to talk about just a few specific considerations. One is just some thoughts about supporting a program on a K award. So a K award is great in many ways. It is great because it provides a solid salary support and provides a requirement for protected time. However, most people on K awards, their salary is more than what's supported by the NIH. And so it's often it's basically up to you, your chair, your division chief, to kind of know where the rest of the salary support is going to come from, and just to know that there's a fair amount of institutional commitment involved in that. What that means is that when you're talking about startup packages or to support your research while you're on the K award, the research costs that come with the K award are unlikely to cover all of the research costs of your project. And so how much is startup, how much is support from your mentor, which often happens, how much is other ongoing support from your department? It's important to have that all kind of lined up in your mind, and probably in a spreadsheet or on paper well in advance, so you know what resources will be available to you, particularly as it goes forward. When getting to R-level grants, at the NIH, anything less than $250,000 direct cost per year is eligible for a modular budget. And modular budgets are often budgeted in a different way, but internally, most universities, most institutions require that you do the same kind of detailed budgeting internally, even if you don't have a detailed budget go to the NIH. And these are rounded up to the nearest 25,000. And so knowing how to project your spending, with detailed budgets, it might be even a little bit trickier, because you have to be able to anticipate future needs and inflation. So mouse cages. I don't work with mice, but I used to work with monkeys. And every year, May 30th, I would get the new per diem costs effective July 1st. And I might be 2, 3, 4, even 5 years into a grant, and I can't go back to the NIH and say, hey, they've increased my per diem costs. I need more money. And so how do you anticipate those needs and then be prepared to divert funds from one bucket into another bucket? And there are some ways that are easy to shift money from supplies to other costs. Equipment is a little bit different because of the way they calculate indirect costs, but anticipating how you will handle inflation, because it's increasingly difficult, especially if you're up against the budget cap, to factor in inflation in a formal way. So you have to be able to do that in your own mind within your own research, in your own research program. Expected costs that aren't flat across years. It's a lot easier to budget to buy equipment in the first year of a grant than to say, okay, in the fourth year of the grant, I'm going to buy this new piece of equipment. And how to handle expected costs that aren't flat across those years. And that's something where consulting with your NIH program people and your own grants management office, as well as your colleagues, on how to do this strategically, because very often, even though study sections aren't supposed to micromanage budgets, very often there will be a concern raised if you increase your spending by $75,000 in year 4 to buy a piece of equipment. It just raises everybody's attention. And so just being prepared how to justify it and how to project that, and how to incorporate that into a budget, particularly if it's a modular budget. It's very difficult to increase extra or to request extra modules in the out years of your budget. Now all scientists, it's always about the next best idea. How, particularly during a K award, you should be focusing on your project, but you have to be developing your new ideas as well. How to finance expansion, how to finance development of new aims. This is where internal, institutional, small grants, seed money, but also agencies, voluntary health organizations, philanthropic sources, that's often the best place to seek a little bit of money to help you go in a different direction. You can always change your aims and add new aims within the funding period. You just have to be able to justify it to your NIH program people. But again, you should always be thinking about the next aims, and to get your next grant funded, you have to have preliminary data to support it. And so again, that's where my quote at the very bottom, keep a diversified portfolio. Having multiple separate sources of funding is really to your advantage, because it does allow you to do some of those new things that might not be within the scope of your currently funded award. Most of you, probably all of you, are physician scientists. Particularly after you get a little bit into your career, often your actual salary is higher than the NIH salary cap. Different institutions have different approaches to this. There's cost sharing. If you don't know that term, that's basically where the funds are coming to support effort that is not supported by the grant. And again, each institution is going to have a slightly different policy about cost sharing. But again, this is where you're going to need the support of your department leadership to assure that you're not always being asked to produce revenue from another place to support your salary that's above the NIH salary cap. Again, that's where institutional support and commitment comes in. Finally, carry forward. Marion talked about this a little bit, that you don't want to end up at the end of a budget year with a huge surplus. You also don't want to go broke halfway through your year. But carry forward, different funders have different policies about carry forward. And I don't remember the percentages of 15%. I forget at the NIH right now. If it's, I think, less than 20% that you're carrying forward, you don't have to justify it. Anything more than that, you really have to have a conversation with your program officer to get permission to carry forward more than that. You shouldn't.
Yeah, it is 20%. I think it is 20%.
I think it is. I haven't been in that position in a long time where I've had more than 20%, but you do have to justify carry forward requests And there are some mechanisms where carry forward is very difficult. And so make sure that you know what the rules are about carrying forward funds. It's great to be frugal, but it's not great to be so frugal that you have money that you can't use because you haven't spent it. So those are just some things I wanted to mention. Again, I think I'll stop here so we can have time for Q&A. And again, each of these may be different depending on the institution where you are, and that's where your grants management office people can be very, very helpful. And also your department chair or division chief to really help you kind of navigate some of these situations.
Both. That was incredibly helpful. I have a quick question, but then you guys all tee up your questions. I'll pay attention to the chat, but feel free to call them out. There's not that many of us. So with COVID, I'm assuming that everybody's sort of been thrown for a loop. And so have you heard or have you talked to people about the carry forward with the whole COVID situation? Is that going to be like kind of like a, okay, we understand, or what have people heard?
So the NIH, their general policy has been as flexible as possible. I think you still have to provide an explanation, but what I've heard from at least through NINDS and NICHD, they are being as flexible as possible. And so if you have unspent funds because of COVID, as long as you have a plan to continue to use them in support of the aims of your research project, I anticipate there won't be major obstacles to that.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of other funders are kind of the same way. They understand. I think the issue is that there's been decreased productivity for a year, and most of what people who run labs pay out is salary. And, you know, I feel really proud that I was able to pay everybody during the pandemic, but there's definitely less output, which means less to write grants with. And I think that's a common problem right now. And hopefully it's not affecting most of you too much yet.
And one of the, when I mentioned unanticipated needs, one of the unanticipated needs was the purchase of PPE for research personnel. And that's something that I don't think anyone budgeted for, yet it's an expense. And again, we've got to figure out where to shift funds from. Fortunately, our institution has been quite supportive in helping make PPE available on a departmental level, but still for certain types of activities, it's the research, it's the PI who's been responsible for coming up with the funds.
There's a very specific question I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer, but in terms of what we can ask for in a K grant, I'm assuming he means like a K-23. Mm-hmm. Does the NIH expect some ratio of personnel to equipment costs? Is there a limit on salaries other than our own that we can support?
The answer is no. That ratio of personnel, again, it depends on what you're planning to do, and is it justified based on your research plan? And some of that might be, your agreement with your institution. They may say part of your offer letter might say that they will support, a lab tech for X number of years, in which case you might have more money to go to equipment and supplies, or they might say, we'll give you this money, these funds for the purchase of, whatever equipment. I think it comes down to, is your budget aligned with your research plan and your needs?
Shannon asks, when you get closer to the end of your fiscal year on your spreadsheet, what type of balance do you feel comfortable having to know you won't run out of money?
I was just laughing at that question. Also, I'd encourage you guys, if you want to, if you're in a place where you can, to turn on your cameras and just ask. I think
it's always good to see a face. There's Shannon.
Hi, Shannon. Shannon, that is a great question. I think, honestly, and I say this as someone who considers themselves successful, I never had enough money. And it's more, instead of being comfortable with a set amount, it's more getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because this is sort of one of the mental toughness skills that you have to build. Like, the ideal thing is if you have at least a couple years of buffer. But there's lots of times in my career, including right now, where I don't quite have that. I think I'm going to run out of money in about a year and a half, depending. Like, and then, but the budget helps me to know how close I am to the edge. And like, for example, like I have a new postdoc starting who I think is a great candidate for a fellowship she's applied for. And if she gets it, then that's great. That really helps my budget. But I have to plan that she won't get it.
Right. And as you get to the end of your fiscal year, there's labor law. And so you can't say, hey, I'm running out of money. I'm going to pay this tech only 50% for this month and then recoup it in the future. You can't do that. And so it's generally the other costs and the supplies that you end up deferring, though most institutions will allow you to spend funds starting a month or two before you actually get them. And so it's possible if you're in your last month of a fiscal year and you're out of money that you can start to spend the next fiscal year funds. NIH has policies about that, and each institution has their own policies on that.
Yeah, that's definitely something to ask about. There's also bridge funding from chairs, which means you're about to run out of money. And if they're convinced that you have a good chance of getting more money in the future, or if they support you, then you will get some. But they're usually somewhat secretive. You usually have to promise you're not going to tell anybody you got them, but pretty much everyone I know has needed them at one point or another in their career. So it's a little, I think it's actually a place where bias really comes into it, which is unfortunate, but it's, to them, a lot of, or at least to my chair, I think a lot of it is about investment. You want to invest in people that you think are going to succeed. And I think the question about the K, it's sort of the same thing. The reviewers want to see that you can do the project, that you have the support to do it. And then they'll invest in you by giving you the K. Autumn?
Thank you so much for this. It was really useful, especially for the budget Excel spreadsheet. That was nice to see how you do it. I also thought that offered some really
sorry, you're breaking up a little bit.
Kind of ever help managing budgets. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm at home. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now.
Now it's better. Try again.
My question is regarding having grad students in your lab and rotating grad students. How do you make the decision of whether to have a rotating grad student or not?
John, you want to take it or should I take it?
Well, I think it depends on, I think I love having rotating graduate students because they are often my future PhD student. Also, it's an opportunity sometimes to get them to do a little pilot work on something that may be part of your new idea. Sometimes they bring ideas to you, and rotating grad students, we typically, at least at this institution, we don't have to pay for. Once I take on a PhD student, I'm responsible for their stipend and health insurance after they're finished their classwork years. And so rotating students will often, it's the trade-off. I will teach you, you will get experience, and you will do some work for me. I think rotating students, as long as there's not too many, so that you can't manage them. My particular approach is I've never taken rotating a graduate student in my lab and said, here, you work with a postdoc. They come and they work with me. And so it's a time commitment on my part. And so generally I don't take on more than one or two at a time.
Yeah, I think for me, I generally say, yes, we have great students. And we actually, a few years ago, switched to a very favorable funding model for us in that our students have full support through their first 4 years. We don't have to pay for them till the 5th year. But they are a time commitment, and you want to make sure, like I do sometimes assign them to work with a postdoc, but then I also meet with them frequently. And Yeah.
Looks like
I think a lot depends on the nature of the work. If it's a lab-based research project as opposed to a human subject-based research project, your approach is likely to be different.
Yeah, yeah. And different approaches. There's no right approach.
This is a problem I never had, but she wrote, do you plan for a set number of grad students in your lab and budget if they want to join? Like, it sounds like they're just flocking to your lab on them. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think you need to know how your institution works and how much they cost. What I usually do is more on a one-off basis, similar to postdocs, is that at any given time, I usually try and make sure I know whether I have the bandwidth and the money to take on another trainee. And then I generally wait for them to approach me. And if I have the money and I think they have a lot of potential, which they generally do, then I take them on. Students are a little harder when you have to pay for them, like we initially did when I started, because even if they're going to be very productive, they're often not that productive for the first few years. I know I wasn't when I was a graduate student. They have courses, they have other things. They haven't always figured out how to troubleshoot effectively, or like they have various issues. Mine was I didn't really ask for help when I needed help, and I tried to do it myself, which wastes a lot of time. But I think you can just kind of see, do I have the money now?
I had a question. Hey, Marion and John, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. This is so helpful. I had a question. I was just wondering how you approached like the initial hires for your lab. Who did you hire first? How did you select them? That type of thing.
Boy, that's a good question. So for me, initially, it was a lab. And my first hire was a tech, because I knew a tech was going to be likely to be there for a while and someone I could hire through our university, as opposed to recruiting a postdoc through, you know, advertising, professional society, et cetera. And I knew I needed a tech. And so that was my first hire. Since then, you know, as I've hired more people, part has been based on need and part has been based on opportunity. I try to anticipate what my needs are going to be and will budget it into my grant budget. But, you know, sometimes you can take on someone who's supported by an F or some other kind of individual NSRA award, which can allow you to, you know, bring in someone that you might not have budgeted for. So it depends on the need and the opportunity. I've had a couple of, I had one postdoc and I had one graduate student who came to me. They weren't particularly happy where they were working at the time. And you know, we're looking for other opportunities, and I was able to scrape together the funds to support them, and it turned out to be a fantastic opportunity to allow me to expand in a direction with someone who had skills that were new to the lab.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things to that. I also am an opportunistic hirer. I guess I would just emphasize that somebody who's either not very good at their job or who disrupts the social atmosphere of the lab can really hurt you, especially when you have a small group, but even in a larger group. And the converse is that if you have people who are really good, you want to be sure you can keep them. So if you don't want to risk losing them because you can't pay for them because you hired somebody else. The other thing I would say is that in order to get good people, one of the lessons I've learned is trust your gut. And I always have a phone call and talk with at least 3 references. And when I was starting my lab, for that first hire, I did the pity thing. I was like, I'm just starting my lab. It's very challenging. And it's really especially important right now that these really be the best people, because otherwise I run the risk of failure. You know, and usually you're talking to other people who run labs, so they know what you're talking about. And I just said, you know, if you were in my position right now, is this the right person? And there were times when I felt like I really needed somebody right away. And I took somebody that I had like a kind of a gut feeling that it wasn't a good idea. And it wasn't a good idea. And usually when I make those mistakes, it's because I like the person and they're very likable people, but they're not effective workers, or maybe it's not the right job for them. And so my advice would be to be very patient and be very careful about who you hire. And then now when I hire people, I do have them meet everybody in the lab and I get feedback from everybody. And I kind of stress to them that it's a teamwork kind of environment, and that they're not going to be as successful if they're interested in just working by themselves, but if they're excited about collaborating with other people in the lab and helping them and having other people help them, then they'll do better.
Keith, you have your hand up. You want
to talk? A similar question to Juliet. Thanks for asking that, Juliet. And I guess one thought on that hiring thing is, I guess in retrospect, I think of hiring technicians to execute more of my ideas, and I hire postdocs to help them build their ideas, and that's what helped expand kind of the intellectual footprint of the lab. And I didn't realize that when I started. So as you get more senior, the technicians, if you're managing them, it actually is, keeping up on all of the ideas and so on actually becomes harder as you take on, especially mid-career, you take on a lot of responsibilities elsewhere. But I did have one follow-up question on how you negotiate salary, because here's becomes a risk of introducing various kinds of bias in pays. For example, like, I had to hire a computational biologist, and that field is predominantly male heavy, and that's a competitive field to hire in. So I was negotiating higher on the salary wage. And then meanwhile, in retrospect, what I did is I started paying my other staff more to bring them up to that person's level. But wondering, how much do you negotiate salary, or do you just sort of keep salaries roughly about the same, depending on level of experience?
Yeah. My experience has been that HR will tell me what I can do. I've actually been surprised how little opportunity I have to negotiate salary. That we have we basically have scales for postdocs, for graduate students, and for technical associates. If you are hiring someone who's a research assistant professor or some other kind of research faculty position, that's different. But I think for students, postdocs, and techs of different levels, very often your HR office will kind of tell you what the limits are.
Yeah, I usually just go by what HR says, but I think there's sort of a larger question here, Keith, that you brought up really well, which is sort of the ethical principles of, like, if you can pay someone less than they deserve, is that an appropriate thing to do just because it's legal and just because you can? And I think that sometimes it can be really hard. You'll all have a lot of pressures on yourselves to reserve your money and not spend it out. But those decisions you make that aren't entirely moral will come back and haunt you. And I think, some of them, you're going to have to make your own decisions about where the line is for you. For me, one of the really hard and fast lines is I don't hire undergrads for free, because I feel very strongly that that is something that keeps science a field for people with family money. Because if somebody has to have a job, that means then they can't work in your lab. And that can be hard. I mean, they don't cost that much money, but it can be hard because sometimes you don't have very much money, and they're like, oh, I'm happy to work for free, but I don't let them work for free. And I do what Keith does. I try and be equitable in what I pay people.
Yeah, I agree. So the person who hired me to my position here did two things. One was, when I signed my offer, he said, our goal is your success. Consider what you have in writing there to be our minimum offer. Let me know what you need to be successful. Now, that wasn't a promise that he would buy me a new palace, but basically meant that he was committed to my success and not to be shy about asking for things I needed. The other thing was, happy people work harder. And so equity is really important. People talk to each other about how much money they're making. That never used to happen, but people talk to each other about that. And so, you want to be equitable, but you also want to make people that work for you know that they're valued. And increasingly, that value is measured in part by how much money you pay. And so to be as generous as you can within what you can afford, you're more likely to have longevity and loyalty.
Yeah, and considering how long it takes to train somebody, if you have somebody good, you really don't want to lose them because they feel like they're not getting paid fairly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would echo the point about people talking. I've heard that from many people. It didn't happen in my lab, but and I would also add here that it's not actually so much an issue of negotiating down with people. It's actually when one person aggressively negotiates up. I think, and just broadly speaking, those tend to there are personality types that tend to do that. And then if you need to then it's a matter of, well, then you really need this person, you really like this person, then do you bring everyone else up in the lab? And that's essentially what happened in our lab. I don't regret it at this point, but I would only say that it's one thing to consider when you're negotiating up. Consider that you might have to negotiate upward with everyone else at the same time.
And you might have to do that. And of course, equity is not the same as equality. You don't have to pay everybody the same amount, but you better have a good justification for a differential, and not just because someone played hardball with you.
Ariel, did you have a question? You had your hand up for a while, but then it went away. I don't know if that's a Zoom thing or not.
Oh, no. You guys actually answered it. So my question was about generosity. And it was a little bit specific, so I was on the fence, but I have an undergrad, and she was supposed to be here this semester for research, and because of COVID, she's actually only been able to work remotely. And my plan had been to evaluate her performance this semester and decide if I was going to pay her over the summer, but it's really hard to evaluate someone you only see on Zoom. And so I had made the decision to pay her over the summer, and I think Marion really directly addressed that. I'd sort of been struggling because I don't have a lot of money. And then the other thing was she's been a rock star. We're submitting her as a first author abstract to CNS. And I've been really on the fence. Like, I really can barely afford, if it's in person, to send me to CNS. And so I've been struck, like, how generous, like, right? Like, I'm not really in a position to be generous yet, but so many people were kind to me when I was an undergrad. And so I was just, and then, sorry, you already addressed it. The long.
I don't think, like, it's very easy to say, oh, you should be generous, but there are cases where it's super hard, and I've experienced that also. And so I don't know that there's a right answer. I think honesty is good. I think when I was an undergrad, or when I was a grad student, my boss didn't have a lot of money, and if we went to a meeting, we would share a room, basically. She and I, not a male advisor. And now I probably wouldn't do that. Like, times are a little bit different. And that is a huge expense when you go to a meeting, is paying for the hotel room.
Can you go back to something, Marion, you mentioned about how you had to sort of twist the arm of your business manager to help you? Because I discovered after a few years that I'm never going to understand this, really. Like, I just have admitted it. And so, but if your business manager doesn't talk to you in language you can understand, I think it's important to say that. Like, I don't understand what you're telling me. And I had one business manager at Stanford that literally I had to ask to be switched because I could not follow any of my finances with that person. And then I found a new person that I could. So can you talk about, like, your relationship with your business people?
So I did that too. I switched because the person I had couldn't keep track of the grants and when they were ending. And I kind of demanded that they do it for me. I basically complained to their boss, and I felt really mean. Am I even be the same person that you rejected? This person's very nice, but got confused about how many grants I had and when they were ending. And, I can't keep track of it. I think the first time I ran into financial trouble in my lab was when I was fairly junior, like maybe 3 years in, and I was having trouble keeping up with it. Like initially I was completely on top of it and doing it myself. And then the person who normally helped me was on vacation, and I met with a different person, and she was like, why doesn't your person do this? And she's the one who gave me that Excel spreadsheet that I showed you guys. And then I went, when he was back from vacation, I said, I need this. Can you do this for me? And then it worked for a few years, and then he got very confused when it got more complex. And I just basically complained and got a different person.
I think some of you will be in departments or institutes where you will have the advantage of having multiple grants management people. And so if it's not a good fit with one, you can find another. Some of you will be in smaller places. You know, when I was at WashU, we had a department of 90 faculty and we had one grants management person. And we had no choice. And of course, this poor person was very backlogged. But I think, you know, it is an important close working relationship, and you have to be able to understand each other and know each other's needs.
It's like people have to go. I see something.
Yeah, yep. You need to go. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Chris.
I will offer if anybody has other questions or wants to discuss other matters, I'll make myself available. And I think my email address is available through the CNCDP website. If not, it's just Google me.
Amazing. Amazingly helpful. So thank you all very, very much.
Nice to meet all of you. And good luck.
Marion, are you going to share that Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah, I need to take a little time to make sure it's completely anonymized, and then I'll email it to Amber and Brenda and ask them if they can share.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.